Hi, my name is Maroš Seidmann, and the name of my presentation will be "Spend 5 minutes on set, go on holiday early." Uh, it's not the whole thing I want to talk about. It will be basically an overview of some techniques for 3D CGI that are quite known, and well used, but not everyone knows how they are created or have a basic understanding how they work. So I will try to explain them, and this is closely tied to the theme of gathering data on set and having the most of it, and uh, not having to then take a lot of time in post production and maybe have less of a hair fallout in the end. Uh, I will break it then down into three categories. Those are HDRIs, photogrammetry, and material scanning on materials in general. You probably, if you work with 3D CGI, you probably know all three of them. HDRIs, HDRI Haven, photogrammetry, Quixel Megascans, materials, the same. But I don't often see a lot of people creating their own, and that can help quite a lot with the final realism of your scene, especially if you are uh, taking a CG object and putting it into your own shot. Uh, okay, today we rely quite heavily on that. We can do the thing in the post production. We can make that later, but gathering data and using the most of it and using it the best way you can, it's very important for saving a lot of time and uh, making your work the more efficient, let's say. First of all, I want to take some overview of your tools you will need. Basically, the images on the right side, these are the three basic things you will need: a camera, ideally with a wide-angle lens, a tripod, and those two reference spheres. Basically, they are used for light reference. You will take a photo of them in the scene where you want to place the CG object. And then you will create also two spheres in your 3D program and like match the lighting. It's really useful to have this, and they can be very expensive, but you don't have to buy those expensive spheres. Basically, you just need some plastic ball and a can of spray paint gray. And the second one, the chrome sphere, that can be a little bit more tricky to get. For example, Mayo, the one who presented before me, he got it as a big Christmas ornament for like 80 euros. Together, like 20 euros of materials. That's really not much, and it really can help with the other things, with the finished thing. Other things you can, they are very useful: meter for some scale references, notepad or just phone for taking notes. I will also mention the 360 camera, especially with the HDRIs. You just basically one shot and you have a finished sphere. Laser scanner, that's tied to photogrammetry. it's the other way of scanning, but a bit more expensive, a lot more expensive. And the surface scanner 10 is topic of its own. Okay, let's start with the HDRIs. It's a spherical image, or most of the time it's spherical image, and it's used for scene environment lighting. It very much helps with the realism of your final shot, and when you use it with the in combination with the reference spheres, you can get a very accurate lighting. The example on the right side, it's from HDR Haven, and they have some like perfectly made HDRIs, but and that takes a lot of work, but it really isn't that much work of getting a decent usable HDRI. Okay. Some things to the setup of your camera, or ideally you want to mount it on the tripod and use a wide angle lens. On the right side, there is the image, the top one, that basically shows you the different focal lengths of the lenses. You need to capture 360 sphere of textures, right? So the wider angle lens you have, the more of that 360 angle you can capture with a single image. So that means the wider the angle, the less the photos you need to take. But the wider the angle also can introduce a lot of distortions. I will show in the next slide. So you have to be aware of that. I would recommend before shooting just study a little bit of basic manual photography, and that will be a long way to getting a good results. Smaller aperture, usually a little bit less light into the lens will get, but they are usually then sharper and the result is better. Use manual white balance. You don't want some photos to be purple tinted, some green tinted, so keep it constant exposure. If you turn your camera to the sun and all of a sudden it corrects for the sun, then there isn't really much of a point of making a HDRI, so keep it constant. Overlap the images next to each other by around 30%. So the software then can stitch, or have a reference that can stitch the images together. And bracketing, that's also something I will explain the next slide. And that's really all you need to know, and you can start shooting. Okay, this is the example of the focal lengths you can see on the left side. On the right side, that's a very wide angle lens, and you can see the distortion I talked about. It can be corrected, at least to some degree, but I find that around those 18-24 millimeters is a good compromise between how much photos you have to take and how easily you can stitch them later together. Now something to the dynamic range and bracketing. Dynamic range is the contrast ratio between the darkest and the brightest part of the image. Our eye it has a big dynamic range, but the camera sensors not so much compared to it. So we need to basically say fake it. On the right side, you can see on a good HDRI, when we turn down the exposure, you still can see the sun. It's as a bright light source. So the software, when lighting, will know that yes, this is a bright light source. There will be a lot light coming from there. And the bottom section, you can see where the dynamic range is low. On the left side, there's a visualization of a bit depth. HDRIs are 32-bit images. The most common images are 8-bit. We need the big range of 32-bit precisely to capture the wide dynamic range of the shot. Bracketing, that's basically a setting that almost every camera now has. When you take a picture, it will automatically take one or more picture overexposed, one or more picture underexposed, and then you take them and you stitch them together to the final HDR image. Okay, my workflow, I use usually first raw therapy. That's a quite powerful piece of software that is free, and it's good for batch editing images if you want to adjust a bit of color, normalize some stuff. It's good thing to have. Don't have to use it if you don't want to. I use Photoshop merge HDR plugin. It automatically merges all the brackets or the bracketed images, so all the overexposed, underexposed together. So I have just an array of basically no HDR images that I can stitch to HDRI, and for that I use PTGUI, or Photoshop, and then some more Photoshop for retouching on some artifacts or something. On the right side, that's an example of a HDRI that we did with Mayo and Patrick for our bachelor's degree film. If you can see it well enough, it's quite noticeable that it isn't perfect. There are some like distortions and not some color indiscrepancies, but it it really doesn't have to be perfect to be good for good use. On the left side, that's the HDR I used with some additional lights in the scene. Don't be afraid to combine those two because you can get a very decent result that will work quite well. Okay, next thing, it's photogrammetry. It's basically a process of recording physical objects through interpreting differences between photographic images or merging them together. It has quite a lot of in common in the HDRIs with HDRIs. It's a very effective way of getting a realistic high quality model without having to do a lot of modeling. We are able to create complex objects and surfaces quite quickly, and they have a wide range of use in for artists and also for scientists. We can use it for other than making assets, for history preservation, for scanning artifacts, for mapping cities and others. This is on a side note. I found this when researching the topics. 3D scanning was used not that long ago in a forest in Guatemala. They laser scanned the forest and digitally removed all the trees and found a, a huge amount of covered up, lost buildings, ancient from, I think it was Mayan era. And really the work took few months, and they said that with conventional techniques, archaeological techniques, it would take like decades, and this was few months. Difference between laser scanner and photogrammetry is you don't use photos and interpret them, but you use a laser scanner that shoots a array of lasers which bounce back to the scanner, and with the time it takes to bounce back, you can calculate how far the object is, and that's the way you scan it. If you want to, feel free to research the topic more. I just wanted to get it here just as a fun fact, you could say. Setup when going to 3D scan. You can use camera and tripod on held or handheld. Usually handheld is better because you probably will, if it's a big object, you want to circle around it. If it's a smaller object, you can put it on some rotating table and just rotate it instead of you going around the object. You also, as the HDRI, you want to get photography from every angle of the object, ideally in diffuse light. Again, constant exposure, constant white balance. Important is recording sides of your sensor in your camera and your focal length, because you can see on the right side that you when you have different size sensors, you can get basically the same looking image, but the focal length is different. And that's important for later for the software to know, because then it will calculate correctly the distance of the points from the camera. If it's not correct, then the object can be warped or not work at all. This is an example which I did with Marian of scanning. It's a Gothic cathedral tower. The remains of it there that is in a park. These were the photos we have taken. You can see that the lighting was a bit uneven, so we had to do some unlighting, but that wasn't a big problem. We also used a drone, and this was basically the final result. And we used it in a school project. It was like, I don't know, 1-2 hours of taking photos, maybe 1 hour, and that's not or just only taking the photos, but also preparation and other things. For the workflow, I use stitch the photos in a reality capture. One thing I didn't mention, you don't really have to use photos. Sometimes it's better to use a video. walk around the object, then convert the video into frames and use like every 5th, every 10th frame. And this can work quite well also. You can then clean up the scanning ZBrush. If you need to make assets, you can use retopology in Maya, or ZBrush has a feature for automatic retopology, which can be useful in basically most circumstances if you really don't need a perfect asset to have. Now for some techniques with the scanning that don't need a lot of work, basically almost none on the final scan, and that can be very useful in the later stages of post-production. They can be used for scale and layout references, for animation, as a shadow catchers, as for reflections onto the objects that will be visible in the shot. Or on the right side, that's an example that I used, a raw scan basically, or a bit of decimated scan as a projection mesh. I just projected one photo on the model, and basically I could now move the camera a bit around and have a bit of parallax effect. And really it wasn't very much work. This is one example of my school work, and here I used multiple of those techniques that I described. First of all, I made my HDRI. You also can see that there are a lot of flaws, but it's wasn't on the, you couldn't see it on the final result basically. Okay, here are those spheres again, very useful for lighting and later. And this I used basically the shot I used in the final. I broke it down into frames. I used every 10th frame, and I plugged it into reality capture, and I got this, which was no work at all. And I got great layout references, great scale references, good shadow catcher, and I can bounce light off the mesh with texture, so I can get even more, let's say, realism into the shot. So this is a good way to make your post-production easier. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about, it will be material scanning. A good thing to record on set when you are, it's taking photographs of the textures, different textures around, especially those that should be around the CG object. That's very useful for later maybe creation of materials, or just as a reference for what type of material you should use at the place. On the right side, that's an example of scene extension, and you can see that probably texture references helped with realism of the extensions. I will break it down further into 3 subcategories is just taking a single photo and using it. Then photogrammetry, that's a little bit different but similar workflow. And then the material scanner tent that I will talk about a little bit more. Okay, this is an example, single shot, it's fast, and you can basically make from it more than you think. You can generate basically the full array of textures from one image. There are multiple ways to do it. The most, I think, widely used or most powerful solution is Substance Designer. You can use it with Photoshop, but it's not very ideal. I will explain why. And I like to use Materialize. Materials, it's a free, I think, open source software that lets you generate basically most of the textures you will need. And big pluses are that it's quite easy to use if you learn there's literally like 10-minute tutorial for the whole thing, and it has a real-time texture preview, so you can basically see the final result you will get, or almost the final result. Of course, that will not be completely the same, but it's very, very useful. Of course, shooting one image and getting all the textures, it has some limitations. Basically, the generating relies on differences between luminance in the object, or also between color that can be used too. On the left side, you can see the brick wall. If I, for example, want to generate a height map, I have a clear difference between the brick and the mortar in the gaps. So I can take the luminance differences and I can tell the software, okay, those white parts, they should be a little bit more recessed. On the other hand, when you have something like the grass, that wouldn't really work because you have a uniform color, so you can't use that. And the luminance differences can work in some way, but there will be a lot of artifacts or just bad stuff. For that, it's better to use basically photogrammetry as the basis of your texture creation. It's the generation itself. It's very similar when to the single photo generation, texture generation, but you have the added bonus of having a very precise height map when you bake the mesh onto a texture. And height map or normal map, and those two are a great basis for other textures that are generated mostly from the height maps. Also, you get a high resolution image when you take multiple pictures and stitch them together. One downside is it will take a little bit more time to get the scan than to take one picture. And the last thing I want to talk about, that's a surface material scanner. It's a little bit different way of getting the surface data. I don't think it's very very used, or when those commercial products that you can get are usually very expensive, and it isn't a lot of them that you can get. Example on the right side is the X-Rite Tech 7, and you just slide, basically put a little sample of the texture into the machine, and you do a scanning like that. That's also limited, that you have to use it in the place that you place the machine. You can't basically take it on the set. So yeah, a solution can be a scanner tent. It's basically an array of lights, of LED lights. You can see the bottom left image that can light up differently and give you different light angles, which can then be later used for generating textures. It has a camera mounted in the top. You can use a polarization filter on the camera to get more variations in the photos, which can then be used for generating more of the textures. And you can automate it, so you can press single button and the camera will take all the photos you need by itself, and then you just need to uh, just need to work with the data. Then on the left side you can see the different pictures it will take from the different angles. Those are used primarily for generating a normal map. If you tell the software different, it can see, basically the software can see the different shadows and how they moved in the different shots. You can light all the LEDs at once and get a good diffuse light for a diffuse texture. Also can use the polarization filter to filter out the specular highlights, so the diffuse will be even higher quality. And then you also can subtract the specular from the rest and basically get specular texture. So you already have 3, and you can generate the rest, and it didn't take much time at all to gather all the data. One downside is that's another thing you have to carry around on the set. And the bottom picture, I don't know if you can see it on the stream, but on the left side that's photo, on the right side that's a like a scan, a material scan, and it's really visible that the pattern on the leather, it looks exactly the same. So this is a very, in my opinion, a very useful tool to use. My goal for the master's degree, I hope it will work out. I would like to build one of these surface scanners, ideally mostly 3D printed, so I can then share it somewhere and other people can print out their own versions. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and especially feel free to study more of these topics if they interested you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maroš Seidmann. I like this presentation very much, and I like also last goal, as you said, about master degree. So I hope it will finish well, and maybe it will be whole world experiment that we will do it.
It would be great.
It will be great. We had so kind of student. Now he is teacher, Mr. Shabik, that he really during his studies made some technology that was unique, and it was very surprising, and he became a very big expert in this area. So there is time for questions, and I would ask Matuš Menke for the first question. He's student of the second year of visual effects studies. So turn your camera and put your question, please.
Hello, hi. I have a question about the HDRIs, and I was wondering if you think if it's better to just quickly take a picture of the two spheres on set, or is it worth it to spend the time and actually take the bracketing images of the 360 HDRI and use that?
Yeah, that's one thing I forgot to talk about. That's the trick with the spheres. Yeah, you can basically take a picture with of the sphere, the mirror sphere, and then stretch it and use it as a HDRI. It depends. If the object in your scene that you use has more glossy material, then you in the reflections will also see the imperfections of the HDRI from the spheres. So in that way, I think it's better to stitch together the bracketed images. But on the other hand, most of the time there will not be much difference. It depends on the situation, and of course you can take a bracketed shot of the HDRI of the reference sphere, so you can still get a HDR image from it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is up on Thomas Sikora, the student of the first class of visual effects. So turn your camera, please. Yes,
Hello.
thank you.
I would like to ask you what's your approach to delighting photogrammetry scan?
You mean like how I lighted the object that I want to scan, or
I mean the photogrammetry data that with the baked lighting. How do you delight it and convert it?
Usually when I make scans or when I use them, there it isn't as important to delight it as you think. And for if you need to delight it, then I usually use just Photoshop and play with the sliders a bit. I think there is a better way to do it, but I'm not sure. But I really didn't have to use a different way than just a little adjustments in Photoshop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for questions. If there are any next questions for our student Maroš Seidmann.